Good morning, everyone. So where I had left off when I last was speaking with you all was about how law enforcement in this case failed to actually investigate the events the state assert transpired on May 17th, 2020. How they ignored leads, how they didn't follow up on things, how they failed to look in places that should have been looked into. So I'm going to go into some of those investigative failures now. You'll hear that law enforcement really did no searches of Mr. Gutierrez around the immediate vicinity of Wood Creek Apartments, where Mr. Gutierrez lived. That there's a wooded park area that is property of UW Parkside, and that all that they did with that area was send some drones to look around. But you'll hear that it was forested at that point, because we're in the middle of May, and that they would not have been able to see the floor of that entire wooded area. So law enforcement looked nowhere close to Mr. Gutierrez's residence in an attempt to find potential evidence. Not only did they fail to do that, they failed to investigate legitimate Crime Stopper leads. So people could call in with tips, anonymous or not, and there was this one tip where an individual called in and said, I saw a woman standing in front of Mr. Gutierrez's sliding door on that concrete slabbed patio on May 18th, 2020. And I remember this because she had asked me what time it was. And I knew it was Mr. Gutierrez's apartment because his sliding door is right next to that exit door. Law enforcement got that information and ignored it. They did not follow up. They also didn't follow up on data that they obtained through a geofence warrant. And you'll hear that a geofence warrant is where law enforcement takes a certain area and asks Google to produce all the information and data on people that they know were in that location on a specific date and during specific time frames. And in this case, Detective Carrera had asked for the geofence data on all individuals who were around Mr. Gutierrez's apartment from May 17th, 2020 at 7 p.m. through May 18th, 2020 at 3 a.m. And that Google produced several hits for people that were in that area. And you'll hear that law enforcement did not attempt to investigate any of those potential people who were in the area at the time the state asserts the crime occurred. You'll also hear that Mr. Anderson did not appear in that data. When law enforcement arrived on scene on May 19th, 2020, there were two dumpsters next to Mr. Gutierrez's apartment, and they had gone and looked at them and noticed that there really was not that much trash. Maybe a bag, a box, and so they called the waste management company and they asked, hey, when was this trash picked up? And the waste management individuals had informed them that the trash had been picked up earlier that morning on the 19th and that it was sent to Zion Landfill in Illinois. You'll hear that law enforcement chose not to go to Zion Landfill and search what would have been freshly dumped garbage that could have produced evidence in this crime. And you'll hear that that could have been because Mr. Anderson, the person, remember, that they had chose as their main character, there was no indication that he had ever gone out to Zion or that he had spent any significant time in the Kenosha area. Didn't fit their script. They weren't going to investigate it. They also didn't investigate Pheasant Run landfill. That was a landfill that they had potential information that Mr. Gutierrez's body had been dumped there. They didn't go to Pheasant Run landfill. They didn't talk to anyone in management at Pheasant Run landfill to see whether there was any individual who dumped off trash that Monday, May 18th, that morning. They did not investigate that lead. They also didn't investigate people that Mr. Gutierrez owed money to. And you'll hear throughout this case that Mr. Gutierrez was in an extremely difficult financial situation. His mom was helping paying bills. He was about to be evicted from his apartment. And he had people messaging him about where their money is and how you don't do this to friends. And you'll hear that law enforcement did not investigate a single person that he seemed to owe a substantial amount of money to. And then they also didn't look into all of the women that Mr. Gutierrez would have been talking to or dating at that time. You'll hear that Mr. Gutierrez had several dating apps. They were located on his phone. He had emails from dating websites, and that law enforcement didn't look into any of the chat strings on there. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. What I just outlined for you is just a little sprinkle of an example of everything that law enforcement failed to investigate. But not only did they fail to investigate legitimate leads and potential other suspects, they also failed to effectively process the scene of the crime. They failed to obtain DNA swabs, fingerprints from areas that, according to their theory, the individual or individuals who was responsible for the disappearance of Mr. Gutierrez would have had to have touched or come in contact with. The first thing law enforcement did when they arrived on scene on May 19th, 2020, was they took a video of them walking into the apartment, of Mr. Gutierrez's apartment, and all of the lights were off. So the state claims that there was this blunt force trauma, this beating, someone was wrapped up in a rug, the crime scene was meticulously cleaned up so that no trace of the other people who were there could be found, that then the scene is staged to the point that it looks like a robbery could have occurred. That obviously didn't happen all in the dark, if they're claiming that this happened around 10 p.m. at night, yet law enforcement did not swab the light switches in the apartment for potential DNA, nor did they attempt to get any fingerprints. In addition to their failure to obtain swabs from areas that could have contained DNA of the people who are actually responsible for Mr. Gutierrez's disappearance, their lack of precision shows immensely in the fact that 9 days after they initially made contact with Mr. Gutierrez's apartment, Mr. Gutierrez's mother, Ms. Patterson, found Mr. Gutierrez's cell phone in the freezer. That law enforcement's there for 8 days. They'll claim that they searched, they processed, they were very thorough, yet they didn't find Mr. Gutierrez's cell phone that was right there in the freezer or the contents of his wallet that were in the freezer. So they did swab the cell phone for DNA, but what they didn't swab or process for fingerprints were the cards that were found, which, according to the state's theory, the person who's involved in Mr. Gutierrez's disappearance would have had to touch, to take out of the wallet, to put in the freezer. And they also didn't process the handle of the freezer. It's also critical that there was no blood on the handle of the freezer. And the phone, interesting enough, the DNA, they send the swab that they took to the crime lab, and it comes back and they say, yep, it's Mr. Gutierrez's DNA on the phone, but there was something that's called a trace allele. And you'll hear from the DNA expert that a trace allele means that it's someone else's DNA, that it's a portion of someone's DNA that did not belong to Mr. Gutierrez, but someone else. And you'll hear that that trace DNA that they found on that cell phone, as I just said, did not belong to Mr. Gutierrez. It did not belong to Ms. Patterson, the individual who found the cell phone, and it did not belong to my client, Mr. Zachariah Anderson. So someone else's DNA is on that phone. You'll also see pictures and hear testimony about how the furniture in Mr. Gutierrez's apartment had been moved. And all of this furniture had been meticulously moved. Nothing's knocked over, nothing's broken. The kitchen table's nicely pushed back. The 2 white tables that were in front of the couch were nicely moved to the side. The couch had been moved, and we can see that because there's indentations in the carpet of where the couch had stayed for a long time versus where it was now. There were no bloody fingerprints or hand marks on the bottom of the couch. They didn't process that for DNA in that area of a couch where the person had allegedly moved it, would have had to have touched. They didn't process the areas of the chairs that would have needed to have been moved, the table that would have needed to have been moved by the person who's allegedly responsible for the disappearance of Mr. Gutierrez. They also didn't process the tools that appeared to be nicely laid out in front of the screen door. Nor did they process in Mr. Gutierrez's bedroom the open window. They didn't process that for fingerprints. What did they do? They processed the blood. That was it. Law enforcement's failure to investigate leads and to effectively process a crime scene is critical in this case. There's no body, no human remains, no murder weapon, no witnesses that can tell you exactly what happened. Yet they wanted to go with the narrative that it must have been Mr. Anderson, and that was someone that they looked into everything possible. They ignored everything else. They ignored the idea that it could be anyone else other than Mr. Anderson. And you'll hear that they meticulously searched Mr. Anderson's property, not just his house, his whole property. No body, no human remains, no evidence that there had been a huge cleanup at a crime scene, no murder weapon. Not only did they search his house, they also searched his family's tree farm, an 80-acre farm, top to bottom, multiple law enforcement agencies, every acre, no body, no human remains, no murder weapon, no evidence of a crime scene cleanup. They also searched Miss Susan Brown Williamson's home, and that was the place that Mr. Anderson had gone in the morning to work that the state claims is where Mr. Anderson, I guess, chopped up a body and put it in bags. They searched that property meticulously, not only the house, but the entire grounds. No body, no human remains, no murder weapon, nothing of evidentiary value. They then searched all of the bodies of water that were near that home and Mr. Anderson's home, not Lake Michigan, but quarries and little lakes. And they had technology that could go all the way down to the bottom to see if there was anything there. That search also revealed nothing. So the person they chose as their main character, the only person they investigated in this case, they did all of that and it yielded nothing. Mr. Anderson, as he sits in front of you today, is presumed innocent. And he must stay that way. Because the evidence in this case, as it will come in through this trial, will not establish that Mr. Anderson committed the alleged crimes beyond a reasonable doubt. And for that reason, when the defense comes and speaks to you, when the evidence is done, we will ask that you return the only just verdict, and that's a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.